everyone. Welcome to the Carpenter Center. My name is Daisy Nam. I'm the assistant director. I just wanted to welcome everyone, and we have a really full and wonderful night ahead of us, so my welcome is very brief. But I wanted to say thank you so much to Cecilia Vicuña and Daniel Borzutzky for coming tonight. It's a really special event. And if you haven't been to Cecilia's show at MFA Boston, it just opened, so please go see that. I'm thrilled to be working again with the Woodberry Poetry Room on this collaboration. They're such great partners, especially Christina Davis and Mary Graham, so thank you so much. And I'm gonna introduce Christina Davis, who is the curator and the director. Thank you.
Welcome. In a recent talk by Wim Wenders about film and poetry, he was asked how often he reads poems. There was a premature laugh in the audience, and he confessed in seeming alliance with the laughter, not many. And then he added, just one or two a day. When pressed to provide a cinematic example of what poetry is to him, poetry, which he said is his artistic litmus and ultimate aspiration, he conjured, quote, the plastic bag in American Beauty, like a cloud suddenly hiding the sun. Poetry in film or as film, he said, is, quote, something not predictable, something precarious, but allowed. Welcome to our inaugural event in CINEPOETICS, a poetry and film series sponsored by the Woodberry Poetry Room and generously co-sponsored by our remarkable colleagues and friends at the Carpenter Center, Daisy Nam and Dan Byers, who have courageously allowed us, the poets, the unpredictable and precarious use of this great space, precarious, which comes from prayer. So say a prayer for us tonight to behave well. I could think of no greater writer and artist and actually fully formed human being to actualize and activate this permission than our esteemed guest this evening, Cecilia Vicuña, whose work I first encountered in the form of a brief poem that has remained with me ever since. It so happens that, like Wenders' image, it too inhabits a plastic bag or uses the humble bag to remind us of the plasticity of possible modes of gathering and how the littlest of the little, how the most minimal of instruments, hands, bags, threads can aggregate immensities. The poem goes, several million years after the creation of autumn and a few years after the creation of the plastic bag, I decided to keep autumn in a bag. What is poetry to you? In its coming toward you, like an element, like an autumn. In her film of the same name, Vicuña carries the question into a range of contexts and human occasions and stands with the question, with poetry as question, incarnating the art form's great capacity to ask, to risk the unpredictable answer, to exist in that precarity of the meeting place that poetry is and creates. By asking through the form of film, she also renovates our idea of the interview, compelling us again and again to, quote, see what words have to say, words which are, she says, a hard look. Tonight, to help us see what Vicuña's words and films and actions and activisms have to say, particularly now at this crucial juncture in our culture, we've invited the award-winning poet and translator and dear friend of Cecilia, Daniel Borzutzky, to introduce her work in greater depth and to field and open the field to questions afterwards. So please welcome Daniel Borzutzky.
Good evening, everyone. First, thank you to Daisy and everyone at the Carpenter Center and Christina and everyone at the Woodberry Poetry Room for inviting me, for inaugurating the series, for making this event happen, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight. I want to begin by re-examining a fixed idea about transnational movement and influence. We tend to think about global influence as moving from the United States outwards. In other words, the conventional position is that the US affects the policies of the rest of the world and not the other way around. Yet, I can't help but see this differently. After all, I'm a falso chileno. I come from a Chilean family, but I've lived my whole life in the United States, living in Chicago, a Latin American city that has re-imported its extreme neoliberalism from Chile, the testing ground for the privatization shock treatments first dreamed up by the economists, the so-called Chicago boys at the University of Chicago, which have now been reenacted in Chicago and throughout the US. I'm stuck with the perception that the bag of shit on one side of the border smells just as bad as the bag of shit on the other. In fact, on each side of every border, the bags of shit smell pretty bad. There's something about borders. Everywhere, they are dividing everything into rancid bags of shit. And I am stuck with the impression that Chicago is a Chilean city and that our mayor would privatize Chilean style our kidneys, our bones, our skin, our sidewalk, our air, our trees, and our children if given the chance. I'm going to switch rhetorical voices for a moment. So the foregoing are the first paragraphs of an essay I published in 2014 called Are We Latino? Memories of My Overdevelopment. An essay that, among other things, critiques the various expectations placed on Latinx and Latin American writers in the US and the various ways in which authenticity and inauthenticity are used to categorize our literary and professional identities. I received many responses and comments by Latinx writers living in the US who recognize some reality related to their own experiences in the essay. But only one Chilean wrote to me, and that was Cecilia, who particularly identified with my characterization of myself as a falso chileno. This resonated with her sense of how she has been perceived by others, and I would suspect resonated with some notion of how she sees herself. She wrote, "Un abrazo por lo falso de falsedad absoluta, tal como yo." A cheer or a hug for the falseness of absolute falseness, like mine. There are multiple ways of understanding Cecilia's celebrating, quote, the falseness of the absolute falseness. First, I think, is a plain rejection of identity tied to nation. And the second may have to do with the way in which Cecilia's work has been, in fact, received in Chile. In conversation, Cecilia has repeatedly stated that throughout her career, she has not been as recognized inside of Chile as she has been on the outside, though this has changed. If this is indeed the case, then we can speculate on a number of causes. The first gets us right into the context in which some of her earliest poems were produced. In addition to a ferocious sense of experimentation, Cecilia's early work is fueled by idealism, multi-genre innovation, and a desire to support and participate in Chile's democratically forged socialist revolution, as in this writing from her artist's book, Sabor a mí, from a page dated August 22nd, 1973, just a few weeks before September 11th, 1973, when General Pinochet's military coup overthrew Salvador Allende and the Popular Unity government. Cecilia writes, quote, "Latin America should never become like Europe or the US. Chile could be the first happy country in the world. A way of being constantly affectionate would grow from innocence and Neolithic ecstasy. Suicide wouldn't exist. Socialism would achieve a cosmic consciousness, the sum of the wisdom of the pre-Columbian Indians and of the many wisdoms of other places. This would give birth to a culture in which, quote, thinking with the belly would reveal so much more than thinking with the head. Thought, perception would grow with increasing joy. There would be much dancing, much music, much friendship." So on the one hand, we see Cecilia dreaming of a utopia, a hope that the good she saw in Allende's egalitarianism and his focus on educating and medically caring for the poorest of the poor would, quote, give birth to a joyful way of living. But on another hand, Cecilia's feminism was neither understood nor cared for by the radical left of the time. It's safe to say, I think, that when she spoke of the political and economic realities of the nation, she was accepted by the power brokers of the left, but when her work turned personal, when her work looked towards the erotics of the body, the leftist men controlling the discourse didn't quite know what to make of her. Which is to say that from the time Cecilia left Chile in 1972, before the coup, her authenticity as a Chilean, as a member of the nation, as she who has the ability to speak authoritatively about what it means to be a Chilean, had already been called into question. Her aesthetic radicalism and feminist positioning was beyond the imagination of much of socialist Chile in 1972 and continues to be beyond the imagination for many readers and critics today. And while she has maintained a readership in Chile over the decades, it seems correct as well to say that for some, she would continue to not be accepted as a writer with authentic dissident credentials. This is complicated stuff and gets even more complicated by a rupture that formed between the dissident writers who stayed in Chile during the dictatorship and the dissident writers who left. Roberto Bolaño's writings that have been read so widely in the past 15 years have exposed this divide by shedding light on the ways in which dissident solidarity, a shared identification with Chile's short-lived socialist project, as well as a shared sense of oppression and exclusion by the dictatorship and the new social order, can easily mutate into an exclusivist form of reverse nationalism. In short, the leftists inside the country telling the leftists outside the country that they have lost their legitimacy to speak authoritatively about the nation. But Cecilia's work also complicates our assumptions about diasporic writing in general, and diasporic writing from Chile in particular, and the expectations such writing engenders. Writers fleeing dictatorships are often expected, in rather direct and didactic ways, to create testimonial narratives, narratives that expand our understanding of human rights abuses, or narratives about the pain and nostalgia of the exile. And even narratives, and I should say nonfiction narratives, that work to create a sense of international solidarity outside of the native country. In this regard, Cecilia's work both fits into and does not fit into the expectations placed upon the diasporic writer. She does, in fact, use testimonial and documentary approaches in her work that asks us to think about human rights abuse and international solidarity. Yet, she is not necessarily telling or limiting herself to Chilean narratives. As in this haunting story she tells in a performance she gave at Woodland Pattern Book Center in Milwaukee on September 29th, 2001, a few weeks after our September 11th. The story of a disappeared man named Luis, an Ecuadorian migrant to New York who was, quote, digging a hole for Con Edison. In short, Luis falls asleep in the hole. His coworkers cover him with rubble and he dies. And I'll quote from Cecilia's performance. She says, and his brother came to the workplace and said, where is my brother Luis? Your brother Luis? Nobody even remembered him. And this is very telling because this is like our position, the position of the little dark ones. Nobody even notices whether we are or we are not there. And this man, the brother, insisted, he's here in his hole. And they fought him and said, no, he's not. He probably disappeared. He went somewhere else. If he was here, we don't remember. Denying the whole thing until he pressed, and finally they opened the hole, and there it was, Luis, crushed like this. So this poem is in memoriam for Luis Gomez. Here, in fact, we have a narrative of disappearance, though it is not a narrative that places Cecilia squarely into the tradition of Chilean history. Instead, it's a narrative that asks us to understand that the violence of neoliberalism exists along a continuum. A Chilean telling the story of an Ecuadorian disappeared in New York as a result of labor and economic policies throughout the Americas and the oppressive conditions that allowed for his unnoticed death and disappearance. Cecilia's poem inevitably produces a hemispheric context for this disappearance, and in the process, she gives more respect to Luis Gomez than he was given by the state, his employers and colleagues, or the conglomeration of political and neoliberal forces responsible for his migration and the migration of so many like him. Happily, though, if older generations of Chileans have not been able to recognize as much in the value of Cecilia's work, we are now seeing a generational shift as younger Chilean artists, writers, and critics who came of age in the post-dictatorship era, or in what the Chileans might refer to as the never-ending transition from dictatorship to democracy, we are beginning, this younger generation is beginning to recognize the cultural treasure that she is. In the last few years, Cecilia has performed numerous times in Chile, received awards, published books, and had major gallery shows. And this, of course, has taken place in the US as well. Quote, "The dream of social justice pervades the history of Chile and Latin America," Cecilia wrote in her afterword to the 2011 reproduction of Sabor a Mí, which she dedicates to the memory of her uncle Carlos Enrique, who was disappeared by the dictatorship. Quote, "It began in ancient times and continues today. It never dies, yet is always thwarted. Sabor a Mí is the broken heart of an era, a heart dropped into the sea with the bodies of the disappeared." And it is this dream that has driven the incredibly diverse body of work that Cecilia has been creating since the late 1960s. Cecilia Vicuña is a poet, a performer, a filmmaker, a visual artist, an activist, an anthologist who has done essential work to bring indigenous writers into print, and, among other things, a radical archivist. In the process, though, she is a model of how one lives their life in the struggles of art and politics, through presence, through resilience, through continuous innovation, through a relentless questioning of history and tradition, through an idealism that is not naive, an idealism that believes with intensity, love, and fervency that we need art to critique, to document, and to survive. It is, as always, a great joy to be with Cecilia tonight and a privilege to invite her on stage now.
Once I start like that, it seems foolish to speak. Like in those sounds, you begin to travel somewhere else. And I suppose we would all be wanting to be somewhere else in a day like today. When we wake up and we hear what's happening, bombs sent to people here in the US. The unraveling, the undoing, dissolution, the slow disappearance of people's rights. Entering the era of distortion, of total distortion, where free speech can be interpreted not only here, but around the world by leaders as hateful speech. Free rein for hate, 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 hate. Oh, hate, 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 hate. The Guarani people of South America have this vision. El odio es amor bifurcado, they say in a translation into Spanish. Of course, they don't think in Spanish, they think in Guarani. This is a phrase that is not even translatable to English, but I will try. It could be like saying hate is really love that has taken two opposite roads. Think of that, a bifurcated, or how you pronounce, bifurcated, bifur or bifur. You see, Latin words don't work in English. Bifurcado. So it's love that has gone like that and tac, transformed into hatred. So, by that definition, what they mean is that that movement can be reversed and turned around. And that's how I perceive the QUIPU. When Christina invited me to come here to do some shows of films for you, with the idea that I had done some films. In truth, I never even knew that I had done so many films, probably more than 100, because I'm not really a filmmaker or anything. I am nothing at all. I just do things that I don't know how to do because I like that. And so I'm going to show you some films. And first, it is QUIPU films. And my understanding of the QUIPU is not what you will find in books. Remember the image I was telling you about hatred turning around, because it starts from actually a distortion of love. And so if love is distorted to become hatred and it can turn around, that is exactly the image of a QUIPU. A QUIPU is a thread that turns around and looks at itself. If you can make a knot in a single thread, you will experience the weirdness of the thread looking at itself. And to me, that is the image of poetry. So I have always understood the QUIPU to be a poem, the knot to be a metaphor for our own awareness, becoming aware of itself. And if we are taken all rights, the right to be people, the right to be mad, the right to be any way we really are, the one right that we must never ever give up is the right to be aware of our awareness. And from that turning around, from that QUIPU insistence and QUIPU teaching, I think we can turn around this world. Can you think of a more crazy, stupid thought? So before getting into the QUIPU, I will just read you something to connect what we're doing here with what's happening at the MFA, where I have the disappeared QUIPU. I call that installation Disappeared QUIPU not only to honor the disappeared from Latin America, the prisoners that were kidnapped and made to disappear by the dictatorships in South America. Thousands and thousands of people were made to disappear, as you well know. But even before that, when the Spaniards arrived and the Portuguese arrived and the Americans, meaning the previous two Americans, the Englishmen and the French and so forth, the Europeans arrived here in the Americas, they made to disappear a world that consisted in thinking of itself in a completely different way. And to me, that's the hurt that is the most powerful hurt, the hurt of not being able to think of yourself and the world in the manner that you have as your rightful birthright. You come out of the legs of your mother, you come out of the womb, and you're aware already. And that is the right that I mind. So, this is what you will find in the walls of the MFA. It says like this. My art began by disappearing. I made an offering for the sea to erase. The waves with our breath, in, out. Dissolving gives life to what comes next. My quipus are impossible weavings, not spun, not plied, they simply hung. Their knots are loose and about to fall off. Nothing holds them together except desire. The desire of each hair to be with the next hair. Quipus are a metaphor for the union of all. They were forbidden in 1583, yet they went on undercover, still weaving our breath. My first quipu was the quipu that remembers nothing. I was offering my desire for memory. So now I will let you see 3 very short quipu films. It was a strange thing to see these films, and especially with those long black pauses in between. And I was thinking how appropriate to have those long stretches of silence and no image, because the quipu is composed through intervals, the same way as words. Words are possible because there is an interval, a break between sound and sound. And it is as if we dwell, that's a word difficult to pronounce, to dwell. It sounds like the tongue twists when you do that, in that pause as a necessary moment. a necessary step in this moment. I will first speak of the last one, the skeleton QUIPU. Actually, I have made very many of these little QUIPU films where I explore what on earth the QUIPU is and why is it that for 50 years I have been dealing with the QUIPU, questioning, wondering, touching it, feeling what on earth is in this universe that was made to disappear with such violence. The last film, The Skeleton QUIPU, is the only one in the group that is filmed with an actual archaeological QUIPU. I was given by a textile dealer as a present a little fragment that had been robbed from a tomb, and he couldn't sell it because he didn't have what archaeologists or museums call provenance. So this little piece is about this long, but it is an actual QUIPU done probably 500 or 600 years ago in the north of Chile. So I put that QUIPU in the camera, and with a macro film, we look at it and we reverse the image of the black and white, and you see this image of the pain and the death of the QUIPU emerging from the QUIPU itself. In the first film, The Umbilico, I am really going deep into what I believe to be a female imagination at the core, in the heart of the QUIPU, which is coming from the umbilical cord. And if you feel like I do, that the knot is like a child hanging from the umbilical cord, then the QUIPU becomes a metaphor for the cosmic umbilical cord, the life force that connects us with the cosmos itself. I often speak of how the women shepherds who live at 4,000, 3,000 meters above sea level and are still thinking in terms of their connectivity to the life-giving force of the galaxies. They're still relating to the stars, as our friend Gary Urton has demonstrated in his works, and a few other anthropologists and ethnologists who take the trouble to go up there and speak with them, hear them, and transcribe their precise thoughts and words. Tell us they think of this unspun wool from which weaving emerges as cosmic gas from which water is born and from which galaxies are formed. So when you're handling the thread, you're not only handling the umbilical cord of life, but the life force that gave life to the galaxies. Think of the conception. So when one of the reasons why I believe when Daniel was speaking of how my work was rejected, he was very kind, speaking of how I rejected by the left. He didn't speak of the other rejections, like, for example, the rejection of the right wing, the Catholics, the rejection of the feminists. I have like this wonderful array of rejections that now become like my honorary titles, because I'm soon going to be dead, and then how it's going to look, And so, as you can see, I'm a very bad person, and I like the thought of things reversing of their own accord. And what happens with this is that in the theorization done by Western feminists, and I'm going to be very unfair in what I'm going to say now, they usually think of textile as women labor, as women domestic labor, as a craft, or are all such things. But what is forgotten is that these concepts are concepts that come after the era of the dissolution of the creativity of women as the main creativity in this planet. And indigenous peoples around the world, and especially in Latin America, what is now Latin America and before it was not called Latin America, have never forgotten the image that it is the creativity of women that gave birth to human culture. And so there are many myths even today. I was visiting my friend David Gass. I don't know if David is in the room. I think, is that you? Yeah. And David did a lot of research in the Venezuelan rainforest with the Yacuana. He has a wonderful book called To Weave and to Sing. And he started to tell me about this menstrual and this female dimension in the South American myths that you find all over. In the second film, the QUIPU AUSTRAL, I was invited to Australia, and in that work, I was given the chance to work in Cockatoo Island, which is a very sacred island of the Aboriginal people of Australia that was turned by the colonists into a prison. So they gave me a whole building to build a QUIPU that would be exposed to the elements. So you could see the wind destroying the QUIPU. And the wind made a second weaving that was on the ground. I don't know if you perceived that the wind created a geometric pattern of destroyed pieces of the hairs. So the hairs and the wind started a dialogue, a conversation that was not ruled by anyone except by their own interaction. And this is what I think is what was destroyed by destroying the QUIPU. The idea that it is the interaction between all living things that is really the metaphor of the QUIPU. The union of things. When I say that phrase, the union of all, I know it sounds hollow from the Western perspective, but from the Aboriginal perspective of Australia, from the indigenous perspective of the Andes, it ain't hollow because those rituals are still practiced today. So that's the end of my talk. And now I am going to invite you to see my first film, which is called What is Poetry to You? And you will notice that it has as many defects as a film can have, because truly I had never studied cinema, and I became a director from 1 minute to the next, knowing absolutely nothing. And so later, when Daniel and I converse, I can tell you some wonderful stories of how all these mistakes came about. So I just let you with that, and we talk later.
¿Qué es para usted la poesía?
Yo espero que prosiga.
Buenas tardes, señor. ¿Qué es para usted la poesía?
La poesía para mí ha sido muy interesante toda una vida, desde que me conozco yo. Conozco muchos tipos de poesías, unas líricas, otras revolucionarias y otras que hacen la expresión del pueblo.
Bueno, la poesía creo que es la expresión.
So I will start with a few questions for Cecilia, and then I believe there's a microphone that can go around, and we'd love to hear questions from the audience as well. And we'll just start with a correction. The film said it was made in 1990, and it was actually made in 1980. And maybe I'll start with the film. I have a kind of cycle of questions, but I was struck by so much in the film, watching it again, but I was struck by one man who said that for him, that he saw a division between what he called bourgeois poetry and poetry of the revolution. And I wonder if you could comment on that, maybe particularly what he means, what you think he means by bourgeois poetry, and then we could get to the second half of that as well.
Yeah, well, it's a good question, because such a question right now, for example, would not even be possible. Have you ever heard speak or talk about bourgeois anything lately? It's gone. That phrase is another disappeared creature, you know. But in the 70s, it was very relevant for the people that I was interviewing. I mean, just the people in the street. And what I'm sure it meant for him is that bourgeois poetry is the poetry of the upper classes, of the rich people who are involved in what we call lyrical, romantic poetry. And he didn't care for that. He obviously only cared for the poetry connected to class struggle, to the liberation of the people. Do you ever hear speak of class struggle or liberation of the people anymore? You see, it's the disappearances of the phrases that is.
So I wonder, before I get to another specific question, maybe you could just say why you made that film and what surprised you in the interviews that you conducted.
Well, you know, when I was a teenager, I lived in Chile, and this was before the military coup. And one day I had a sort of experience that if I were dead, it would be plausible, but since I'm alive, it's implausible. And is that I was like 17 years old, and suddenly I saw a word. And as you could see, like this bottle talking about plastic and plastic bags, I loved what Christina said. Where are you, Christina? I don't see you. Over there, yes. And it is, I mean, we see this, but I had the experience of seeing a word like I see this. And when the word was seen, and I became aware that I was seeing the word began to open up. So I was able to understand how a word is composed by a structure of sound and silence, and there's sort of a complete, what I call a big bang, like an immense universe inside the word. And I remember when I told about this that I had seen to my poet friends next day in Santiago, they all thought that I was silly as usual and that this means absolutely nothing, so they paid zero attention to what for me was a revelation that changed my world completely to this day. And so I thought of doing the film because when I arrived in Bogota in the year 1975, I was originally exiled in London, and I didn't want to be part of what in London had become what they called actually the radical chic, meaning the people who were leftist and very, charming and adorable. And this was a bullshit world for me. And so I wanted to go back to South America, and one of the few countries where there was no dictatorship at the time. There was civil war and violence and guerrilla and so forth, but still you could have a sort of life in the cities. Was Colombia. So I proposed an exhibition of this vision of the words that I called palabrarmas, the words that are the only weapon allowed. And originally, the director of the museum of the Universidad Nacional said, "Oh, great." And then he completely forgot that he had said, "Oh, yeah." So this exhibition never happened. It actually happened for the first time in Chicago this year. So I had to wait 40 years for this exhibition to take place. So getting back to why I made the film. So in this film, this vision of words as something that has the power of radically changing your perception of language itself is the way I see the QUIPU. Is like the QUIPU has an agency of its own accord by the fact that it reverses, it turns around. It is always revealing new things, new angles, new possibilities of understanding. The same is true of language. But I realized that nobody spoke of language in such a way. That's why I did the film, to see if people perceived poetry as something relevant. And from what surprised me is that everybody, the prostitutes, the poorest people, the beggars, everybody had something to say about poetry. Even the people who believed, "Oh, I have nothing to say," they were still saying something. And for me, the most beautiful expression is a man that the cameraman was not fast enough to capture because I asked him the question and he disappeared in the crowd very fast. And since I am no director, I didn't know how to direct. So we only hear the sound. I asked him, what is poetry to you? And he just said these two magnificent words, que prosiga, meaning to allow for it to go on. I couldn't think of a better answer than that.
Another thing I was struck by was that so many of the answers were, poetry was a condition that people felt. It wasn't a product. It wasn't a thing on the page. It wasn't something that one picks up and reads. It was something internal. What do you think that film would be like if you asked this, if you tried to make it today? How do you think that people would respond?
Yeah, many people have asked me, and actually I think some people have tried that, but I think it would be completely different answers. Because I think if you think of 1980, culturally in Latin America was still like a remnant of the culture of the previous eras. And you, in the film, what you see is the aliveness of oral culture. And in oral culture, everyone has complex speech. Everyone has access to complex ideas. It's not dependent on whether people are educated, whether they know how to read and write. And when you spend time with indigenous peoples, you realize that knowledge and complex thoughts do not really necessarily relate to what we call recorded, written knowledge. And this is something that when you realize that, it opens a universe for you. And so I think what has happened since then is that with the, let's say, the colonization of the mind that the academy performs not only here but everywhere, people have come to identify culture, poetry, things like that, as in the definition that the academy produces. And I don't think people are aware of how much control of definitions that exerts. And it is the controlled definitions that I think are limiting the imagination and limiting not only the quality of perception and the depths and possibilities of perceiving, but also of communicating and relating. So to me, when I see this film, which I probably have seen hundreds of times, it never ceases to fascinate me how people are so enjoying their own speech. You know, they're speaking and listening to themselves with such pride, you know. And isn't that a thing of beauty?
I think I could ask you questions all night, but at this point, let's turn it over to the audience and see if there are questions that you could address.
Some people spoke of the revolutionary aspect of poetry, but apart from that, and in addition, especially to this sort of inner tenderness that many people felt when they tried to express what it meant, do you have thoughts on in what senses poetry is social, celebratory, loving, or other, dear emotions that are part of our social life?
Yeah, I think I will answer picking up something that Daniel said that struck him in the film, which is the idea that the people in the film perceive poetry as a condition. You see, that is a very, very important observation, because when I have spent a lot of time studying one single poem that was composed orally in the desert of Sonora. This is a Yaqui poem, and actually this is a book that hasn't been published yet. But what I understood from that poem is that the people of Sonora, who have sustained the continuity of this poem probably for thousands of years, they understand poetry as a state of mind, And so if you ask me, what is the social function of poetry, I would answer you by saying, what is the social function of the awareness of a state of mind? Think of our minds completely invaded, occupied by cell phones, by the media, by this, by that. So where is our relationship with our own state of mind? And where does that intervene in the way we exchange, any kind of relationship, any kind of encounter? How do we negotiate? And so you see the result of the elimination of the state of the room, the space for the relationship with the state of mind, in that people don't want to be together, don't want to join, don't want to participate. And friends tell me that even the young people in the universities, why are we losing all our rights? Where is the agency of the people? So all these things are connected in ways that we are not yet willing to acknowledge, you see. And I think that is a profound social function of poetry, relating to all those dimensions of feeling that we have to suppress in order to function in a society that requires of us work. Production.
When I asked the question, I was thinking specifically of an anthropological idea of communitas, which is a social, spiritual sharing within a community. That was a beautiful answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. It was really beautiful. It's really beautiful, inspiring to hear you and hear the way you speak. And I wanted to ask you, what was the first poetry that you heard in your life, or the first words that you remember hearing in your life that made you start loving poetry, loving words, and that relationship?
Well, my parents tell a story, and they said that I was an abnormal baby, in that, I was the firstborn, so they probably paid a lot more attention to me than to the children that came after. And my mother is an Indian, and so we lived in the countryside, and I was kept, naked most of the time, winter, summer, and so we had fruits and animals and all kinds of things around us. And my mother says that, actually it's my father who tells this story. He says that at one point it's summer, so I may have been, I was born in July, so summer is like 4 or 5 months after that. And they are giving me a pitch. And the first word that I uttered, according to them, was my interpretation of the word durazno. And of course I was a baby, I wasn't even a year old, so I shouldn't be saying words, But they were completely struck by the fact that I enunciated a word. So the first poem I heard, in my opinion, is the transformed name of that durazno, And so they say that I look at it and I actually picture them seeing, because these ripe duraznos in Chile, you touch them, the juice spreads in your hand, because this has not been in a supermarket, it has been taken ripe from the tree, so the smell, it suffuses everything. So the word enters into the juice, and the juice comes back into your mouth. I think my poetry comes from such perceptions. And so this was a house full of books, so I don't know what was the first poem I read or I heard, but there were many poets in my family. So poetry was everywhere. And my grandfather was friends with Gabriela Mistral. He was the lawyer of Neruda when Neruda was persecuted by the Chilean government. So I probably heard these poets. I can't define for you a moment other than the story of the durazno.
Cecilia, thank you for your wonderful comments. And I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned in between the films. You commented on the black screen when we had that moment of waiting before the next film rolled, and you talked about how the spaces between words, like the spaces on the QUIPU, are necessary for them to function. So I was just wondering if you could say something about the similarities and the differences in your work with language and your work with textiles and your work with film. I know that's a big question, but you work in so many media, and I wonder if for you there are some ways in which you feel there are essential similarities or real disjunctions when you're making art.
I wish I could answer. I don't know what I'm going to come up as to invent an answer as if I knew what I was saying. But in truth, I mean, I think I do these different things because I don't know what's happening, and that is what fascinates me, you know. And I think if you become aware of words as, how can I call them, creatures, beings, entities, all those words seem false. They don't seem to quite describe what a word is, because it's something so real, so powerful, so life-changing. For example, I suppose you remember a painting by, not a painting, un grabado, how you call that, a print by Goya, where it says something like, words hurt more than knives. You know, we have all experienced that. We will never forget an insult, a hurt. And this is why I began with the notion of hateful speech, how our society has become like a vehicle for hateful speech. Where is that going to take us, you know? So if we reverse that thought and think of what a word is collectively, we're going to come up with a different society, a different universe, a different world. So the same thing happens with the textile. Why do I do textiles? You know, my mother was an Indian without a loom. So you can't say that Cecilia was exposed to the ancient tradition of weaving. No, the tradition of weaving had been demolished, destroyed, extinguished by the time I was born. So what did my mother do? My mother knitted. And so I have this image, and I have poems for my mother where I'm crawling like a little animal. Under her feet, Mama is a giant, huge woman. Of course she wasn't, but in my imagination she still is that way. And so she's handling these threads, and I am under the threads. And if you look at my work, a lot of my work comes from that perception of the tiny child that sees the threads as immense things like waves, you know. And so I suppose that when I go into the textile, I do like I did with the peach, you know, enter into the juices of the empty spaces between the threads. And I trained myself as a child to see in the X-ray vision. Have you ever come across this notion? And it's something that is prevalent in Paleolithic and Neolithic art and indigenous arts around the world, that it comes probably from the hallucinogenic experience. And I'm sure the hallucinogenic experience is not very different from the way the child, the uncontrolled child, sees. The fact that you can see within structures like, and so I still can see the textiles in that manner. For example, if you go to see the QUIPU at the MFA, you will see that it's unspun wool. And if you will not be allowed to touch it, because now museums don't allow you to touch the work, but I conceived them originally to go inside. And if you go inside, you look at those hairs, and in the second film, you could see some of those hairs filmed with a macro lens. And you can see the universe inside the hairs. And so I would say that even though these mediums are so different, and in the film I'm always attracted to the macro, but there are two kinds of macro from my perspective. The macro where you can see in the very minute, and the macro where you can see the whole society, the whole collective, the whole humanness of a large group, acting as one, which is one of the dedications of indigenous peoples, to have always the dual experience of your profound individuality and also the group as one. And that is something that has been destroyed by colonization. And even, for example, in the time of the popular unity of Chile before the coup, I have written an interpretation of that era as an era where the mestizo culture still admitted the indigenous interpretation of togetherness, of joining, of being what this gentleman called comunitas, of being something that is a collective body. Now, when you say that, it's like a theory from a French book, Isn't that sick? How can that be so?
Maybe I'll conclude with one last question. So many artists have move on from the work they have done in their past, right? And you are somebody who there is such a pronounced continuity between the work that you have done. I mean, you've done work in all sorts of zones, but as you talked about in Chicago, you presented work this past spring, which had originally been created 40 years ago, and then which you came back to make for that show. And then you talked about your engagement with the QUIPUs being something you've been doing for 50 years. I wonder if you can kind of talk about how you see yourself, how you see the kind of work that you did in the 70s and 80s, and as it relates to the work that you are doing now.
Que fresco. In Spanish, you say, that's really a fresh question. How on earth could I think of that? I don't know. For me, all is rotten, all is gone, all is nothing, and all is full of beauty and mystery at the same time. And when I was hearing you, I was thinking, why would this be? And I think my perception is that when you are deeply into whatever you are doing, there is this multidimensionality of the instant, of the moment, where no matter at what moment in your life you are, as an ancient old person or as a young baby that's beginning to see and understand, I think it is possible to feel a sort of the eternity of time and the fleeting nature of the moment as two aspects of the same thing. That is so impossible to comprehend. It is such a paradox, but to me, paradox and absurdity is what really makes us. And I thought a thought, but thought went away from me a moment ago of what I wanted to tell you about that. And maybe the moment will bring the thought back later on when we are gone from this gathering. And so I don't know what is relevant of the 80s, of the 60s, or the 70s. But I know that when I go back to any one of those old works, I am instantly again in the moment of creation. So this is what makes it possible for me to revisit works that I did 40 or 50 years ago with complete freshness, because in the moment I am in the presence of the image, of the poetic composition of that idea, of that drawing, that line. I am in complete awe of the ability of the poem, of the art. And I have to say that I experienced this with the art of any other person, not just with mine, or the poem of any other person. And I'm sure people in the audience had this experience. You read a line by William Blake, for example, just to give any name, and you can imagine what he was feeling in the moment, and it's not something written 3 centuries ago or 2 centuries ago. It is as if he had composed it in that very moment, and you were inside his head in that moment. That doesn't mean that you see the same thing that he saw. Not at all. That's not even necessary. But the witnessing of the creation is something that is beyond space and time.
I asked because I knew the answer would be good. So with that, we will conclude. There are books outside the theater for people who would like to buy them. Thank you again to Cecilia.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, you all.